The reading this week looks at decolonization and studies of disability and the relationship between colonial discourse and the body. So I'll begin by showing you this clip about eugenics. And we've discussed eugenics in previous lectures, um, specifically when we looked at Michel Foucault's writings regarding biopolitics and nation building. So, one of the ways that we can think about the relationship between colonialism, nation building, and disability studies is to think about the history of eugenics and the relationship between attempts to socially engineer the population by instituting discriminatory policies, laws, and regimes that controlled reproduction um, and nation building. So the author discusses the ways that the politics of extermination often involves targeting populations of people who are seen to be unfit to reproduce the ideal citizenry in the future. And some of the most extreme and fortunately horrific examples of extermination have involved eugenics and efforts to sterilize those who are thought to be unfit to reproduce ideal citizens.
Fresh spring savings are in full bloom at Canadian Tire. Save up to 30% on select outdoor furniture, barbecues, storage solutions, and more until March 26th.
As a new widow, Sarah Rosas Garcia was already struggling to support her 9 children when her oldest daughter was picked up by local authorities. Andrea Garcia had been accused of skipping school and being sexually promiscuous, so the authorities responsible for juvenile delinquents committed her to a state hospital. After being administered an IQ test and assigned a low score, the doctors made their verdict. They told Sarah her 19-year-old daughter would be sterilized to prevent passing on what the state saw as a mental deficiency. This horrific tale may sound like a story from an authoritarian regime, but in fact, it took place in Southern California in 1938. And Andrea Garcia was one of thousands of poor women of color targeted by the state's relentless campaign of eugenics. Since ancient Greece, there have been efforts to control human populations via reproduction, retaining some traits and removing others. But in the 19th century, the discovery of evolution and genetics inspired a new scientific movement dedicated to this endeavor. In 1883, British scientist Sir Francis Galton named this idea eugenics, drawing from the Greek word for to be well born. This wave of modern eugenicists included prominent scientists and progressive reformers who believed they could improve society by ensuring that only desirable traits were passed down. However, their definition of what traits were and were not desirable was largely determined by the prejudices of their era. Entire categories of people were considered unfit for reproduction, including immigrants, people of color, and people with disabilities. Meanwhile, their ideal genetic standard reflected the movement's members, white Europeans of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon descent. As the influence of eugenics spread in the early 20th century, many countries restricted immigration and outlawed interracial unions. These measures to improve so-called racial hygiene were taken to their horrific conclusion in Nazi Germany. The Nazi eugenics campaign systematically killed millions of Jews, as well as individuals from other groups, including Roma, gay men, and people with disabilities. Outside their extreme brutality, however, Nazi eugenic policies reflected similar standards across the globe. Throughout the mid-20th century, many countries enacted eugenics policies, and governments in Sweden, Canada, and Japan forcibly sterilized thousands of individuals. Sterilization was exceptionally common in the U.S. From 1907 to 1979, U.S. policies enforced the sterilization of over 60,000 people, with 32 states passing laws that mandated sterilization for men and women deemed mentally defective. This label was typically applied based on superficial mental health diagnoses and the results of IQ tests, which were linguistically and culturally biased against most immigrant populations. These racist standards were particularly problematic in California. From 1920 to 1945, Latina women were 59% more likely to be sterilized than other women, and the rate of sterilizations in California was incredibly high. This single state performed over one-third of the country's sterilization operations. Such was the case of Andrea Garcia, whose story reflects thousands of individuals with similar fates. With the help of famed civil rights lawyer David Marcus, Andrea's mother argued that California's sterilization law violated the U.S. Constitution, depriving Andrea of her rights to equal protection under the law. However, while one of the three judges overseeing the case voted to spare Andrea, the other two did not. Records suggest it's possible Andrea escaped the impending surgery, but many more victims of these policies did not. Although eugenics acquired negative connotation after the horrors of World War II, many of its practices, including sterilization, continued for decades. By the late 1960s, research into human genetics was more nuanced, and bioethics had begun to blunt eugenics' influence. Yet Sweden and the US continued to pursue involuntary sterilization well into the 70s. Finally, class action lawsuits and protest marches in the US galvanized lawmakers, and California's sterilization laws were finally repealed in 1979. Unfortunately, today, the legal and illegal sterilization of many oppressed communities still continues around the globe. How did IQ tests come to be used as a tool of eugenics? Dig into how these tests have been used and misused throughout history with this video.
So, as we've discussed, nation building has often involved this sense of necropolitics. And necropolitics is a concept from Achille Mbembe, who discusses the ways that colonialism was often guided by this politics of death. And while Foucault discusses the way that biopolitics refers to the ways that the state intervenes in our lives through things like warnings on, um, say, alcohol packages or nutritional facts on things that one eats. And this is the way that state intervenes in our lives to try to support health. But what Memembe argues is that colonialism always often involved this politics of death, with European nation states investing in the death of others for their own financial purposes and the purposes of European nation building. So the authors of this week's reading discuss the ways that Indigenous ontology and Indigenous peoples' experiences of colonialism belie this clear bifurcation of humans and environment, of body and space. So we're often used to thinking about human beings as being separate from land and environment. And the argument that they make is that many indigenous philosophies, cosmologies see an individual's relationship to land and space as being central to their personhood. So, ontology is the branch of philosophy, specifically metaphysics, that studies the nature of being, existence, and reality, exploring what entities exist and how they can be grouped or related. It classifies the fundamental categories of what there is, ranging from physical objects to abstract concepts. So, Indigenous ontology and Indigenous peoples' experiences of settler colonialism belie a clear bifurcation of humans and the environment, or bodies and space, land appropriation, resource extraction, linguistic genocide, and forced removal, erasure. and devastation by settlers invariably wreaks havoc on the land, spirit, livestock, and bodies of indigenous peoples. Rejecting logics of elimination and imagining alternative futures in opposition to the capitalist state's projection of futures devoid of disability and indigeneity is essential for realizing national and bodily self-determination and for non-indigenous, disabled, and indigenous peoples in the present and into the future. So, the destruction of land in favor of capitalist expansion is central to genocidal policies and practices, including policing, forced sterilization, and murder of indigenous peoples. Capitalist expansion and the rapid speed at which people must produce, perform, and be judged is also central to the ways that ableism um, imagines a future in which we are guided by Darwinism and these principles of survival of the fittest, irrespective of legal histories and laws that protect people with disabilities and protect Indigenous peoples. So, this kind of unfettered capitalist growth and this selection process of those who are the fittest and most productive and will generate the most growth are actually ways that the law and human rights laws and employment equity can be consistently violated. How does Indigenous feminist praxis theorize disablement and challenge disability oppression without being named such or recognized as such by non-Indigenous scholars of disability studies? How might Indigenous peoples' critiques of liberal humanist ontology and conceptions of interdependency in mind, body, space inform disability studies scholarship, particularly in grappling with settler colonialism? What insights might Indigenous epistemologies offer regarding the tension between valuing disability and rejecting interwoven systems of power? So it is important, I think, to think about the law and the ways that just the desire to make more and more money and to expand industry without any reference to law can lead to illegal acts of mining indigenous lands. It can also lead to human rights violations, such as the murder of Indigenous women and girls, and sterilization of Indigenous peoples, and to the refusal to hire people with disabilities and the refusal to hire Indigenous peoples. The disablement of land body as a tactic of settler colonialism has persisted for centuries and takes various forms. By highlighting Indigenous struggles to protect Mother Earth and her sacred resources, we suggest that Indigenous ontology, specifically relationships to land, challenges disability theory at the epistemological level by rejecting the taken for granted dualism between the environment space and disabled human bodies with settler disability studies. So, Indigenous resistance significantly centers not just on people, but on land, relationality, prayer, love, protection, and reverence for the environment, suggesting that decolonial disability justice necessitates accounting for the disablement of land consequent of practices and logics of settler colonialism. While disability theory has compellingly pointed to the ways in which the construction and production of inaccessible space renders disabled bodies abnormal or aberrant, Indigenous peoples, informed by Indigenous epistemology, have consistently intimated that the disablement of space via settler colonial practices of land appropriation and destruction in pursuit of profit concomitantly yields the disablement of Indigenous bodies and worldviews that are intricately woven together with space. These issues strike us as particularly urgent given that much of what is recognized as disability studies scholarship is produced by non-Indigenous people within settler colonial states. So the article looks at the relationship between settler colonialism and the production of disability studies and efforts to exterminate populations that have been historically deemed to be undesirable because of colonialism, Nazism, racism, and unfettered capitalist growth without any respect for the law. This is a clip regarding disability justice.
Disability justice.
And it offers definitions of what disability justice is.
Definition and explanation. In the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, understanding and addressing disability justice is crucial. Disability justice is a significant aspect of this discourse, but what exactly does it entail? Disability justice is a framework that recognizes and addresses the inequities faced by people with disabilities, especially those from marginalized communities. It goes beyond the legalistic approach of disability rights and focuses on the intersection of race, gender, class, and other social identities. Disability justice emphasizes collective liberation, ensuring that all disabled people, regardless of background, have access to opportunities, resources, and societal participation. Disability justice is an evolving framework developed by a group of Black, brown, queer, and disabled activists. It was first coined by the disability rights group Sins Invalid in 2005, while disability rights focus on the legal rights of individuals. Disability justice takes a more intersectional approach by recognizing how different systems of oppression overlap. It acknowledges that disabled individuals from marginalized groups, especially those of color and LGBTQ+ communities, experience unique forms of discrimination and exclusion that require targeted solutions. Many systems in society, including education, healthcare, employment, and the legal system, are not designed with disabled individuals in mind. While disability rights movements have achieved legal victories, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, these achievements have not fully addressed the disparities faced by disabled people of color and LGBTQ+ disabled people. Disability justice provides a more inclusive framework to challenge systemic barriers. In the US, Black disabled students are disproportionately disciplined compared to their white counterparts. A disability justice approach would not only advocate for equal treatment under the law, but also push for culturally relevant teaching practices, restorative justice in schools, and support systems that recognize the intersecting challenges these students face. Disability justice is an essential framework that goes beyond traditional disability rights by focusing on the unique needs and experiences of marginalized disabled individuals. It calls for intersectional approaches to address the multifaceted ways in which disability interacts with other identities, leading to a more inclusive and just society. As organizations and movements continue to prioritize DEI efforts, disability justice must be at the forefront to ensure that no one is left behind. Welcome.
So the authors write that when disabled folks talk about crip time, sometimes we just mean that we're late all the time. Maybe because we need more sleep than non-disabled people. Maybe because the accessible gate in the train station was locked. But other times when we talk about crip time, we mean something more beautiful and forgiving. We mean, as my friend Margaret Price explains, we live our lives with a flexible approach to normative time frames, like work schedules, deadlines, or even just waking and sleeping. My friend Allison Kafer says that rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. I have embraced this beautiful notion for many years, living within the embrace of a crip time that lets me define my own normal. And yet recently I found myself thinking about the less appealing aspects of crypt time that are harder to see as liberatory, more challenging to find a way to celebrate. Now in my 40s, as I reflect on my life, these other ways of looking at crypt time have been pressing deeply, leaving their mark. So, disability studies is an interdisciplinary field, and we've discussed it in previous lectures. It develops its own theoretical paradigms. It necessarily borrows from various sources. Such borrowing means that disability scholars have not had to reinvent the wheel, but have been able to build on the conceptual foundations of identity based theories that have grown out of other interdisciplinary fields, such as gender studies and critical race studies. But disability studies offer as much to its predecessors as it borrows from them. So the authors are interested in offering a theoretical argument regarding the relationship between Indigenous ontology and studies of disability, particularly looking at the ways that eugenics and social Darwinism have been embedded into colonial discourse. And so, what they're interested in critiquing are the ways in which colonialism and unfettered capitalist growth often lead to this politics of extermination, where certain groups of people uh, are not thought to be competitive enough or good enough to belong to the future nation state. And this logic has obviously been challenged by human rights laws and the most extreme kind of politics of extermination is something that I've discussed in previous lectures, making reference to histories of Nazism and the ways that Nazi policies often constructed groups of people as being unfit to be part of the future nation state. And obviously, this history of Nazism was defeated by war and by the passage of international human rights laws that champion the rights of all people to work and to live and to survive and to be part of the future. So, as academic corollaries of minority civil rights movements, queer theory and disability studies both have origins in and ongoing commitments to activism. Their primary constituencies, sexual minorities, and people with disabilities, share a history of injustice. Both have been pathologized by medicine, demonized by religion, discriminated against in housing, employment, and education, stereotyped in representation, victimized by hate groups, and isolated socially, often in their families of origin. So, queer theory and disability studies often share similar points of critique regarding societal stigma and social exclusion. Perhaps the most significant similarity between these disciplines, however, is their radical stance towards concepts of normalcy. Both argue adamantly against the compulsion to observe norms of all kinds. This stance may even be considered their raison d'etre, since both emerged from critiques levied against the normalizing tendencies of their antecedents. So, decolonization and disability studies obviously are rooted in a tradition of human rights. Human rights laws dictate that anyone fleeing persecution has the right to seek asylum in another country. So when one is persecuted because of their disability or because of their race, religion, class position, sexuality, they have the right to seek asylum. And when someone lives in a country and their human rights are consistently denied, they're denied housing, employment, safety, security, freedom from persecution, they have the right to seek asylum. So anyone fleeing persecution has the right to seek asylum in another country, anchored by the 1951 Refugee Convention and Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These laws guarantee protection against non-refoulement, return to danger, and ensure fair treatment, including access to justice, education, and health services while refugee claims are evaluated. So there are key principles in international and Canadian laws regarding freedom from persecution. Firstly, fundamental rights. Individuals have the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. Non-refoulement, which means return to danger, a core tenet that prohibits states from returning refugees to a territory where they face serious threats to their life or freedom. The Canadian framework, governed by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which is the RIPA, which aims to provide fair consideration and a safe haven to those in need. Asylum seekers can make a claim at a port of entry, which is a border or airport, or from within Canada. Claims are reviewed by the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, the IRB, to determine if the individual qualifies for protection. Rights of claimants. While awaiting a decision, claimants are protected from discrimination, may have access to health care, and can apply for work permits. So if people are discriminated against consistently because of their race, their ethnicity, their national origin, or their disability, they have the right to seek asylum. And Canadian human rights laws are extremely important because Canada has made the case that it is a safe country for those fleeing persecution because of their race, their gender identity, their sexuality, and their disability. So when countries in the global north make the claim that they can resettle those seeking asylum, they must ensure that citizens and all people who live within the borders of these global north countries respect human rights. So this is a clip regarding Indigenous issues and disability studies. And it's a presentation by a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney in Australia.
Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, custodians of the country throughout Australia, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to all of them and their cultures, and to elders both past, present and emerging. Afternoon all, my name's Darlene McLennan, and on behalf of ADSET, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on meeting the needs of Indigenous students with disability. Sharon Kerr is currently undertaking her PhD at the University of Sydney, focusing on the needs of Indigenous students with disability. Today, Sharon has kindly agreed to present to us a presentation that she gave to the Pathways 14 conference last year. It seems like a lifetime ago, last year. So we just thought some people were unable to go to Pathways, or some people may have missed the presentation while they were there. So this is a good chance for us to catch up on that. For those who want to access the captioning, you can find that in the ribbon, which is either at the top or the bottom of your screen, and you can turn the closed captions on. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the presentation, please feel free to email us at admin@adset.edu.au. Sharon will be presenting for around 50 minutes, and then we will allow for questions, which I will ask. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to add them into the question box or the chat box, either one. We haven't quite worked out yet. This is only our third webinar using Zoom, so we haven't quite worked out which is the best way to go. So we're trialling both. We think with the chat pod, you can actually choose to either just put the chat to us, or the chat can go to everybody if you want everybody else to see your questions. All right, so that's about it. So now I'll be handing over to you, Sharon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darlene, and hello to everyone. White questions, black answers, and this is the topic of my PhD that I'm doing with the University of Sydney. Many of you will have, I've worked with many of you over the years while I was working at Macquarie University with MCAS and through other various programs that I've been working with. Like Darlene, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and that's for everywhere that we are. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the knowledge which I'm going to share. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. John Gilroy, who is an Indigenous academic and is one of my supervisors for my research. And the members of my Indigenous advisory group, I have Rosalind Sackley, Maria Robinson and Naomi Carolyn, and they continue to provide guidance and insight with regard to Indigenous knowledge and cultural safety, and the people who have generously shared their stories with me for this research. So let's go. As a teacher and as a support practitioner, I've had a number of questions that I've set out to find the answers for. When I was at Macquarie University, we were providing support right across Australia to students with disabilities. It was actually many hundreds of students a year that we would be providing support to. And one of the big concerns that I had was, why was it that Indigenous students with a disability weren't presenting for support? Now, this was back in 2008, and it was at a conference in Melbourne that I met with Rosalind Sackley, who heads up my Indigenous advisory group. She very soon after came and worked with me, and together that started a 10-year pursuit of research together. So the questions were, and for my research, why is it that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders with disabilities are not presenting for support? What are the barriers, both real and perceived, for students who need support? And how can we mitigate the impact of these barriers? When we look at the barriers, some of them are so huge, and you think, okay, here I am in my TAFE, here I am in my university. What can I personally do to mitigate the impact of these barriers? Hopefully today we will address some of these. I'd like to draw your attention to a report that was compiled by the Australian Institute of Health. Now we're on the fourth slide for those of you who are following with the PowerPoint. The AIHW in 2011. And they were examining the data and responses for Indigenous adults with a disability and asking them what were their attitudes towards further study. Now, what I found really interesting here was that 30% of those Indigenous Australians aged 18 to 64 with the most severe level of disability had wanted to pursue further study in the 12 months prior to the survey, and 13% of them were unable to do so because of caring or for family reasons. When I started pursuing this study, people were saying to me, oh, look, why would it be that Indigenous people with a disability would want to undertake study? And the truth is that 30% in that survey said yes, they wanted to undertake study. And 13% were unable to do so because they themselves were carers for other people. So, myth one is that Indigenous people with a disability don't want to study. And maybe the next thing is that they don't have any other responsibilities. Quite often, our Indigenous students themselves are caring for other people with disabilities. All right, I'm on page 5 of the slides now, and this is a chart which is looking at the results of the 2015 Survey of Disability, Ageing and Carers. It has a lot of data on it, but there's 2 particular things here that I wanted to draw your attention to. Arrow 1 is looking at the experiences of discrimination. Okay, so experiences of discrimination due to disability were almost twice as likely than non-Indigenous people. This is what they actually experienced. So when we're thinking, why aren't people putting their hand up saying I'm having a disability? The reality is for Indigenous people with a disability, discrimination for them is double that of the general population. The other thing I want you to have a look at is the second arrow down here. It's pointing to the graduation rates or the students coming through with disabilities past year 11 in high school standards. Now, in 2012, that figure was 39%. In 2015, that figure rose to 52.7%. So that figure is increasing. The students Indigenous students with disabilities who are getting higher levels of education and coming into our TAFEs and universities are on the increase. And so this is why it's very important that as practitioners, teachers, support workers, that we are aware of this significant increase occurring. Next slide. White questions, black answers. Now, looking through the literature, and I'm going to look at some of these barriers today, it is evident that multiple barriers exist for Indigenous students, multiple barriers exist for students with disabilities. And at that intersection of being Indigenous and having a disability, there are enormous barriers. Now, the important thing is that these are different for each person. Thus, there is a real need to listen to your students and identify their needs. This webinar is going across Australia. The experiences that are being experienced by students on the outskirts of Sydney will be different to those being experienced by students in Kalgoorlie. We must listen to our students and identify what their needs are. All right, from the literature, barriers include poor access to quality education from preschool to year 12. Now, the implication here is that if you haven't had that strong foundation in education, then you haven't got the foundational learning skills, learning how to learn. One of the things that I've been involved in for the past 2 years, my husband wasn't well, so I went back to the classroom and I was working in local schools. And it was so evident when children had had no access to early childhood education, how they presented in the classroom. if they didn't have that foundational skills of learning how to learn. So that's the first one. If a child hasn't had access to strong foundational educational experiences, then that puts them behind the.
So stop there. There's a lot of interesting work that is being done about education and the relationship between education, disability, and decolonization. And we've discussed crip time, and crip time is a theoretical concept that asks us to think about the ways that our time, our ideas of time, are structured around uh, normative ideals of embodiment that might exclude people with disabilities, and create this kind of excessive competition and productivity, this constant strain on the body to be productive and move at rapid speeds. Um, and so scholars of disability um, often discuss the widespread oppression of disabled people perpetuated in many societies globally. And they look at the ways that societies must take responsibility for people with disabilities, and also the ways that societies must question how institutional discrimination works by celebrating